your life. Anybody else? Hello.
Don't look down here.
You're not. I can see people when they sign in.
See, they'll pop up here.
Hi, Michael.
Don't look down here.
Hi, Nancy and Lisa. Stacy. Hi, January. Miss Pam. I'll have my cup of tea afterwards. Dawn, you made some great masks. Robin thought she'd just give Amy a break here first thing and just chat with you and say hi. See how your day has been? Mine was very hectic. Thank you all very much. I like hectic. Hi, Sheila. We appreciate y'all joining us tonight. You're in for a good live on binding. You know, Amy's the best. Getting a lot. Oh, I like hectic, Miss Lori. That means I'm busy taking orders. Hey, Amy Thompson. Can't wait to see you again. Hi, Melinda. Hey, Jackie. Love you too.
$1, thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Nancy. Miss Charlotte, hope to see you soon as well, honey. Hi, Diana, Karen. Hi, Miss Sherry. Mailed your package today, Miss Kimberly. Hi, Tina. I miss everyone. It's really hard not opening those front doors, girls. But we will again. It's hard. Hi, Diane. Hey, Kristen. Hi, Betsy. Miriam.
Hi, Diana.
I have two. Hi, Diana. I have two quilts that need to be. Hi, Wendy Lee.
It's not your daughter.
I know. She says hi, Robin. Hi, Sheila. Diane Hess. Good to see you signing in.
She's got a drink. You have her cocktail.
Oh.
Diane, you have your cocktail ready?
I didn't bring mine down. Hi, Robin Bean from South Carolina.
Okay.
You ready?
I'm ready. It's been 5 minutes.
All right. My time is up, girls. Great to see you. Amy will be joining you now. Bye-bye.
Hi, guys. You ready for a quick, well, I mean, not so quick. I won't be as long-winded as I was with thread. But we will talk a little bit about sewing binding onto a quilt today. How to miter corners. How to do an invisible, non-bulky finish to join the two ends back together. And then I'll talk about hand sewing and some techniques and tips for machine sewing the binding down if you're not a hand sewer for that purpose. So let's get started. I'm gonna move. So again, close your eyes if you're motion sick and we will get you back up here as soon as I get us acclimated here. Okay. Let's see if I can get some of those shadows to maybe go away. Don't know. Okay, I think we've almost got our positioning here. Let's make sure. All right. So I typically bind a quilt using a 2.5 inch wide binding. It can be anywhere. It's your choice as to what you like. So 2 1/4, 2.5 are pretty typical standard binding widths. I'm going to try to tilt this a little bit more. Nobody needs to see. Okay. So this is a 2.5 folded, was seamed together, folded wrong sides together, and has been pressed. I'm using little miniature quilt pieces here so that I didn't have a giant quilt for us to use. Yes, Miss Amy T, that red thumbnail is hanging in there. It's the only one that's left, but it is not going anywhere. And I'm doing a really good job of not trying to pick at it. So we're going to talk about how to start your binding. First, you're going to have your quilt all trimmed up, backing and batting and everything nice and even. It's not so much on this scrap piece here, but you get the concept. I'm going to take my binding. This is only about a 6 to 8 inch piece, but I'm going to leave a tail between 8 and 10 inches before I start sewing the binding on. So let me actually flip this around, because that way I think it may not look backwards to you guys. Let's see. So I'm going to start sewing, and when I sew a 2.5 inch binding strip on my machine, I use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. When you put your quilts and things in fairs and shows for judging binding is usually the one thing they're going to nail you on if you don't do it well. So you want to make sure that you have your quilt should completely fill all of your binding. So if you were to fold this over and fold back, there should be no gap in between. You shouldn't be able to fill any excess space in your binding. You should also have the same amount of binding on the front as you have on the back. And those are the things that we look for. So with a 2.5 inch wide binding strip, I use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If this was a 2 1/4 inch binding strip, I would use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Therefore, if this was just solid border around the outside, 2.5 is fine. But if this was a block that had points, I would be using a 2 1/4 and a 1/4 inch seam allowance so I don't stitch into any points that were there. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to always start on a straight edge. Don't ever start in a corner. I'm going to leave about an 8 to 10 inch tail. I'm going to come down and I'm going to start sewing 3/8 of an inch. Now, when I sew 3/8 of an inch, in order to get a good miter, we're going to stop sewing 3/8 of an inch from the corner. So I take a little measuring gauge or a ruler. It can be a regular ruler. I'm going to mark 3/8 from the corner. So I would measure up. You can put a little pencil mark. You could put a pin there or whatever. I'm going to sew to that mark. I'm going to put my needle down, and then I'm going to turn and I'm going to sew at a 45-degree angle right into the corner. What this little diagonal line does is it allows you something to fold your mitered corner back against. So it's going to give you a nice little guideline for folding, crease type thing. Okay, so once I've sewn into the corner, I'm going to cut my thread and take it out of the machine, and I'm going to rotate this. Now let's see if I rotated it correctly for you guys. This mirror imaging stuff in FaceTime and Facebook Lives and stuff are throwing my mind for a loop here. Now, I'm going to start folding my miter by taking my tail. I'm going to fold it back so that the diagonal fold here goes 45 degrees right into the corner. Okay. So this should be a nice straight edge. This should go right into the corner. I'm going to hold on to that, and then I'm going to bring my binding towards me. Now when I do that, I am making sure that this edge here is folded up. They're stacked one on top of each other, and this fold here is even with the raw edge of my quilt. So I'm going to flip that, because I think that will make more sense here. So I'm back here like this, and I fold it down. So the raw edge of your binding should now be lined up with the edge of the quilt that you're getting ready to sew. Okay. You want to make sure that this is not offset or uneven. This needs to be all lined up and stacked on top of each other, nice and neatly. Now, I'm not one to pin binding on and things like that, but I will take a pin or a clip and I will just kind of clip it in place and hold it. And then I'm going to start again with my 3/8 inch seam. Okay. So it will look like this. I'm going to start at the edge of the quilt and continue sewing. Now, if you're having a hard time, if it's really bulky and you're having a hard time getting started, and this goes for anything, not just binding, I probably should have sewn this binding on in a different color so you could see. Sorry about that. So if you're having a hard time getting started, because it could be slightly bulky here because you've got your quilt, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of binding fabric. You can start in front, back stitch to the beginning, and then come back forward again. If you start off of the bulk and sew onto it, it's much easier than trying to sew on the bulk. Yes, and like Miss Nancy said, you can use a stiletto to hold everything in place for you as well. Okay? So start on the edge, sew all the way down, and then you're going to repeat that same process. 3/8 of an inch, turn, sew into the corner, fold back at a 45, and then fold back forward. Okay. Again, making sure that everything is lined up and stacked up. Okay. All right. Now, we're going to come on around and we're going to get back to where we started. Okay. When we started here, and we're going to come in this direction, I want to end at leaving the largest possible hole that I can. Okay, so 10, 12, 18 inches. The more space you leave from where you started sewing and where you end sewing, the easier it will be to join these together. Okay? Yes, Miss Jackie, I backstitch everywhere. That way if you lift all these. But it's not super necessary at the beginning and the end because you are going to sew over them again. So once you have your opening, your tails are ended, we're going to take our bindings and we're going to bring them together. And we're going to fold them back onto themselves, leaving approximately 1/8 of an inch between the two folds. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, we need to trim these tails so that we know where and how to join them. The magic number is the distance from the fold to the end that you're going to measure is half the width of your binding. Now I know I just gave you math, okay? Half the width, this and that. Now, here's my tip. This is your binding, right? This is half the width of your binding. So you can take the tail end, you can lay it on top, matching the fold of the binding or the raw edge with the fold that you just creased, and you're going to trim just through the tail end of the binding. You're going to remove this. And then you're going to do the same thing here. Again, measure and half the, yes, Miss Jackie, in terms of sports, half the distance to the goal. That's how we have to remember it. You can also take a ruler and a pencil and do your markings or anything. Either way, whatever works for you, but I usually don't have a ruler at my ironing board where I do this. Now, once we have those marked or trimmed, and this is what they'll look like trimmed, we'll be ready to join them. Okay. Now, what's going to happen, I'm going to take, this is my ending tail. I'm going to take my ending tail and I'm going to open it up and place it to the, place it right side up to the side of the quilt. I'm going to take my beginning tail. I'm going to open it up so that the right side faces the quilt. And then I'm going to rotate it and match my creases. So now you see why that space here is important, because you're going to be flipping them to join. Okay, so I'm going to match the creases that I've got going on. I usually pin it. Then I'm going to sew, and when you look at this, I'm going to sew from what I call the upper left-hand corner to the lower right-hand corner. Okay? I'm going to sew over my pins, not between my pins, but over my pins. Okay? So, upper left to lower right. Got it? Now, before you do any trimming or anything, or get too excited with this, before we do anything, we make sure that this is correct and that we haven't twisted and that we haven't measured incorrectly. Okay? So, we just kind of pull out, lay it out flat like it is. Make sure that everything fits. It's not too big, it's not too small, that there's not a twist in here. Once you've guaranteed that you have it right, you can trim this at 1/4 of an inch, okay? Press it open and then repress your binding and then finish sewing the 3/8 of an inch. Okay. I'm going to go back to Jennifer's question real fast. Jennifer, it's actually, you'll end up matching both creases. They should, both the cross crease and both the horizontal and vertical creases should line up with each other. And that's going to help you keep square. If you don't hit it straight on, it's okay. And that will help. At least you don't want to be terribly off. But if you match both creases in that, you should be good. Yeah, the key to this is that this needs to be at least 1/8 of an inch or, slightly bigger. You don't want them butted right up next to each other. Okay? If you're doing bias binding, I would actually put this more at 1/4 of an inch because I find that the bias binding has a tendency to stretch a little, and it always ends up a little too big for me. But if I do this at more of 1/4 of an inch, I get better end results when I'm trying to join bias binding together. Okay. And then you have a nice invisible finish. You'd have no idea that where you started and ended your binding on the quilt. So no more folding and tucking things in. I won't allow it. I will gladly show this to you anytime when you come in the store. It's the best way to do your binding. Okay? Now that your binding is sewn on, okay, let's talk about what's next. Okay. I go to an iron and I iron out. I iron my binding all the way out, so it's as far out on the back against my seam as I can. Okay, so this helps make sure that you're going to get this turned and you've got everything as far over as you can. What our goal is that when you turn this over, the fold of your binding should just come to the seam of what you use to sew your binding on, or just right beyond it. Okay? Does that make sense? And I'm going to show you how to hand sew. Okay. So push it all the way out, good iron with some steam maybe, or really hot, one or the other. Let me turn this over. Get it in the shot here. Hand sewing, and I will go back and do machine sewing in a moment. So when I'm going to hand sew binding on, I sew binding to the front side of my quilt because I'm going to fold it to the back side of my quilt and hand sew. I'm going to cut a piece of thread that is no longer than the distance from my fingertip to my elbow. Okay, so we want short. I'm going to tie a quilter's knot. Now I'm going to try to do this, and I think you may be able to see the thread, but a quilter's knot is you're going to take your needle and you're going to lay it horizontally. I'm going to bring my thread tail, okay, and I'm going to lay it over top of my needle. Again, I probably should have picked another colored thread. Sorry. I'm going to wrap this thread 4 or 5 times around the needle. Okay. And then I'm going to stand my needle up. I'm going to pull those wraps down between my finger and thumb, and I hold on to them while I lift my needle and slowly pull it up so that you will have a nice little tiny tidy knot at the end of your thread. Okay, let me see if we can get that in the shot here. This is, you can see it a little bit. So, little tiny knot. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my first stitch through my backing and batting, okay, below the seam line of where I sewed this on at, okay, and mostly that's so that I can kind of bury that knot, okay. Now I use Wonder Clips to clip my bindings and hold them kind of in place so that as I'm going along, I'm not battling with my binding wanting to be folded to the front. So I just use, a handful of clips. I don't clip the whole thing unless it's small, but I wouldn't be clipping an entire queen size quilt because it'll jingle all the way around there, probably end up pulling some of them off. I also don't use pins for this because you'll be stabbing yourself the entire time. So now we've got our tail and it's kind of coming, I have it coming straight up so I can see where my tail is at. Right where my tail is at, let me get a hold of my needle. My hands are cold. I'm having a hard time holding on to this. I'm going to get my binding right there at that stitching line, which is right here. I am going to go, not a good demonstration to do when you can't get a manicure. I'm going to go into my backing and batting, right where that thread comes up, and then I'm going to come out through the fold, as close to the fold in that binding as I can get. Miss Lori, I'm using 50 weight R-fill today. A needle, I use whatever size needle you're comfortable holding on to be honest. I think these are just, I think this is a standard sewing or sharp 9 or 10. It's not too little, but not too long. But really, whatever needle is your choice. I had 50 weight. I wouldn't use anything thicker than 50 weight. I would do 50 or even 80 depending upon what you were doing. So the closer you come out to the fold in the binding, the more invisible this will be. Okay? I'm going to go, so now this is where I came out. I'm going to go into the backing and batting right behind where that thread came out in the fold. And I'm again going to take about a 1/4 inch and I'm going to come out right in the fold of my binding and pull my tail. Okay, so I'm just going to do this a couple of times. Can everybody see that? I know it looks backwards on your screens. Let me see if I can flip this around and if I can do it backwards. In terms of which direction you go in the quilt, or how you hold the quilt, it's all personal preference. People say that I hold it backwards, but it's just what feels comfortable to me. So if I, yes, I think it is what would be considered left-handed. So if I was the other way, I would be going like this. So I'm going into my backing and batting, right behind, right below where my thread comes off, and I'm going to come out right in the fold of my binding. So into the backing and batting, and I'm doing that not above the binding, but I'm coming in to the backing and batting right below or right behind and below where the binding folds up to. Okay, so ooh, this is a challenge for me. So it is very invisible, and I'm not even using, I'm using cream colored thread. So it's not like I've even matched my thread to my binding fabric. So if you've done a truly invisible job, you won't be able to see that stitch. And the key to it is, like I said, actually, Miss Joanne, it's right, you're going into the backing and batting. Let me see if I can get any closer here. Let me see if I can get the camera to focus that close. Let's see. It's actually, I'm going to get my needle where I have it, and then we'll see if we can, see if I can change the lighting a little. So it's actually, I'm actually below the binding when my needle goes in. Okay, so I'm not here. I'm taking my needle and I'm going into the binding. In terms of matching thread, Miss Pam, to be honest, if you're not 100% with making it truly invisible, I would go with match your binding. You really shouldn't see any of it in the backing fabric, so I would match your binding if you're not a 100% invisible stitch yet. Okay. Questions about this? Okay. Now, the foot that I use to sew binding on with, because remember I told you you're going to sew a 3/8 inch seam allowance. You're obviously not going to use your your 1/4 inch foot. If you use your 1D or 34D or 39D or walking foot, on the 1, 34, 39, the edge of the presser foot, if your needle is in center, is 3/8 of an inch. Okay? So when I'm sewing binding on, it would be the edge of this foot with the edge of my raw edges of my project. And that's 3/8. Versus leaving your 1/4 inch foot on and trying to follow the 3/8 of an inch line on your stitch plates. Okay. Now on a walking foot, 3/8 is in a slightly different location. And let me see if I have a walking foot here. I may not. No. So on a walking foot, I don't have one here at the moment. It must be in my travel case on display at work. On the walking foot, the outside edge of the sole of the walking foot is 1/2 inch. So the next line in would be 3/8. It's like the inside of the cutout. Okay. This is foot 34. Okay, 34C or D for those that have dual feed. Needle is in center, yes. Okay, so you can leave your needle in center and then that outside edge. So 34, 39, number 1, okay, they're all, you can double check your measurements, but everything should be about 3/8 of an inch to the outside edge of the foot. Now, machine sewing binding on. I'm not a huge fan of it, okay? But it's personal preference. If I am going to machine sew binding on, I am going to be sewing to the back of the quilt and then flipping to the front because I prefer that. Doing it from the way you would hand sew it down and trying to stitch in the ditch can be very challenging to make sure that everything stays where it belongs. If you are going to do that, I would suggest gluing this in place so that it stays where it belongs and not just trying to use clips, because these two places, if I clipped, would stay where they were, but there's nothing saying that this section between is going to stay where it belongs. So I would glue. Gluing, using like Roxanne's Glue Based It, even a little bit of Elmer's washable school glue. You just need little tiny drops. You don't need it to be so much glue that it makes this wet, okay? If you're not into that, you can use 1/4 inch wide Steam-A-Seam tape and you can fuse it in place and fuse it down and hold it. And at that point, if you didn't want to hand or machine sew it, it would probably be stuck good enough that you could just leave it like it is, especially if it was a wall hanging and it was never going to be washed. The other thing is I would, while you're learning and practicing, you may decide to do like a decorative stitch here, like a feather stitch, something that jumps both left and right with a center stitch that will help to kind of make sure that you catch things. Okay, so that's an option. I am a person who prefers you to sew it to the back and flip it to the front. So 1 second. Forgot to get that sample out. Okay. Sewing to the back, flip to the front. There are a couple of things that you can use, and I don't even have presser feet. You can do this with the same feet that we used to sew this on, and then when you flip it to the front, you want to stitch as close to the edge of the fold of the binding as you can. Okay? A couple of feet that you can do that with. One would be a 1/4 inch foot. And what I would do is I would be following using a stiletto and holding this fold down, keeping the fold of your binding on the inside of the needle cutout. Let me flip that around. So you can see. Okay. So the inside of the needle cutout. Not the inside toe of the presser foot, but the actual needle cutout. If you follow the inside toe of the presser foot, it's too wide and you have too much of a lip. So if you follow the inside of this toe right here, that will help keep this. The other foot that you can use, which gives you a little bit more visibility, would be to look at your number 20. Now remember, 20 is an open foot, open toe embroidery foot, and embroidery meaning decorative stitches. So I would use this foot, get my binding folded so it sits right inside that opening, using a stiletto, and move your needle, which would be left or right, depending on how you feed this underneath the machine, but it should be, I think, to the left. Let me see if I'm at, yeah, move it to the left. I told you, my brain does not work in mirror image, ladies and gentlemen. Then using your stiletto, move your needle to the left as close as you can get it to keep on the fold of the binding. Okay. Okay. If that makes sense, I hope. And the other thing is you can use permanent glue to glue it down too. So that's the other option if you're not into binding. Or you go back and watch yesterday's tutorial on the no bulky, no binding finish, and then you don't have to worry about binding at all. Okay, so I don't mind hand sewing. I can't do a lot of it at one time, so I usually do, a side a night. Like this little table runner that I have here, I could probably do in an evening, in a couple of hours, but on a quilt, I usually do a side a night because if I sit down and try to do the whole thing, I can barely move my hand to the next day. And I think a lot of it is I'm just holding and pinching so much on a little tiny needle versus something much thicker. When I do sew, and again, when you machine sew binding on, nothing says it has to be a straight stitch. You can very well use a decorative stitch, something that jumps back and forth. I've seen a blanket stitch used to hold this down. The other foot, Miss Diane, would be the number 10. The only reason I don't like the number 10 is when I come to the fold in the miter, I have a tendency to, it has a tendency to catch it. And so that's the only reason why I don't use a number 10, if that makes sense. Oh, let me show you how to fold the miter on the corner when you get to the back of the quilt. All right, let me get my mirror image going here. Okay. Now, when you are folding your miter for binding, typically one direction is going to fold nicer than the other. So it's a matter of figuring out which, if it's not folding nicely one way, try it the other, okay? So I'm gonna fold one end over, and when I'm sewing this, I would sew up to, basically, I would hand sew it to the line. It's hard to see maybe, but this is my stitching that I use to sew my binding onto. So I would hand sew up to that point here. I'm gonna take and then fold this over. Okay. That miter should come right diagonal into the corner, and then your other binding should line up with the seam. Okay, so, and then you'll have this beautiful little folded piece. If it doesn't look exactly perfect, let me see if I put some clips on this, if I can get it to stay. You can fiddle with it till it's perfect. Okay. You can faux sew that miter and just make it look pretty and sew it in place. Okay. When I hand sew this down, I don't hand sew this unless it's a baby quilt or something. If this is just a placemat or table runner or wall hanging, I don't worry about invisible stitching up this fold that's here. I do it for a baby quilt and things like that because, you know, the kids, they just find that corner and they just keep digging and digging and digging until they have a hole there. But for quilts, for machine binding, I do the same thing. I would sew to that edge, fold my miter over, and then come back the other way. Okay. Does that make sense? Then you have really pretty miters. Okay. Now, this runner here, it's got a funny angle to it. Okay, it's not a 45-degree corner. Okay. Yes, Jennifer, I do stop and knot off at the corner. If I was machine sewing this, I would just stop with my needle down, pivot, and keep going. Okay. This one, these funny corners, I'm going to treat them just like this was a true square corner. I'm going to sew down and stop 3/8 of an inch from the end. I'm going to sew into the corner. I'm going to fold my 45-degree, but I'm just going to line the fold up on top of itself and on this side. Don't have an edge of a quilt to make it even to, okay? This 45 isn't really a 45. It's a 33.5, I believe. And that way, when we go to fold this, you will have to do what we call fake miter it. Let me see if I can get it to kind of do it. But you will have to fiddle with this so that it looks like a miter. It's not going to be a true miter. So on the runners and things that have those points on the ends and the corners, you will have to do a little more fiddling with these ends than you would if you were dealing with a true 45-degree corner. Okay? I hope that makes sense. It's easier to do when you're doing it, not when this is hanging out there. Okay? But it'll look like a 45 on the front, and just the back you'll have to. Who's looking at the back anyway? Just make the back look as close to pretty as you can. Everybody pays attention to the front. And like I always say, if somebody says something about it, say, well, let me see you try. That's my answer. Well, let me see you do it. Any other questions while I go back? Yes, Miss Happy, you could clip the fabric in the corners, but I only do that if when I fold this, I really can't make it, but I don't want to clip too much from the corner because then it won't fill the corner of the binding. So I want to be careful how much I clip here so that this doesn't end up hollow and not as full as both sides of the binding that way. Okay, so let me go back here and just answer a few things. Let's see, I think I got most of them. Needle thread. Yes, Miss Virginia, it is a single thread. So all I've done is used a single thread, pulled it through, and I just have a little tail at the beginning. Okay. All right, I think I answered everybody's. Foot number 39 was just the one I happened to, or 34 was just the one I happened to have in my hand today. I can't find my number 1 foot for my machine. Can you believe it? There's 3 machines in this room and I can't find a number 1 foot anywhere. Okay. Other questions? I think we have everything. I'm going to flip this back up here so that you can see me while I plug my phone in here before it dies. I'm going to get a new phone tomorrow because this battery not lasting 10 seconds is not happening for me. Okay. And when that means Amy gets a new phone, means that Material Girls is going to get a text line. And you won't have to text me or Mom on our personal phones, and we won't be getting text from you at like midnight looking for something, because unfortunately we do sleep with our phones in the room because that's what the alarm company calls it, the alarm's going off at the store. So love you all to death, but I'm gonna get a text line for the store so that we have a dedicated number that you can put on your phone as your contact. And that's how we can communicate with videos and text messages for looking for fabric and machine issues and things like that. So that number will be coming soon. Let's see, I have a couple more questions here. Let me change my thing. Too many things. Now, I know, have you ever, yes, foot number 71, that was the one. That is another foot, and I will post a link in the comments of this video for that technique. And I didn't have a foot 71 here tonight, and I forgot to grab one. Oh, no, I think I sold the last one last week that we had with the panic. So I don't have a 71, but I will post the tutorial on using foot 71, the lap seam technique, using the lap seam foot to machine sew with the binding down. You use it to sew the binding on as well as the binding down. Let's see, what other things we got? Yes, Miss Connie, unfortunately I do have to have my phone in my room because the alarm goes off, I gotta know whether to dispatch police or not. And we are, Miss Nancy, I have been working on an online store, and I am hoping for everybody that is what I've been working very hard on the last 2 weeks when this all started to get it up and running. So hopefully soon it will be ready, and you will be able to shop 24/7 from the online store for Material Girls. Unfortunately, it won't have everything we have in it right now because I just cannot possibly fathom over 10,000 products into the store and finding pictures and things like that. But we're getting there. We're trying to get the basics up and the newer fabrics, and we'll just keep growing as we go. So you'll just have to wait a little bit longer for that. Oh yes, thank you, Miss Lori. Was the first, it's a little chilly down here, so I grabbed the coat that hangs in my sewing room. And yes, Miss Happy, this is my sewing room. So I will take you guys on a tour one day of this room. Right now, it's, again, an absolute chaos because it has everything from all the lives the last week is sitting around in piles. I got quilt as you go, I got thread, I got binding stuff everywhere. So once I get that all straightened up, I will share with you guys some organization tips that I have, although I don't have any stash fabric in my sewing room. I only have scrap fabric in here. My stash fabric I don't really have a stash because y'all won't let me sew with stash because all you want is what I have sewn the sample with, and I can't sew a sample with stash fabric because I don't have it to sell to you. So I don't have stash. I just have scrap stash. So pretty much every scrap that we've ever made a sample with is living in this room, and it's gonna happen. Amy's gonna go through it because it's starting to overwhelm. The containers are too full. And so I have some things that I will talk about organizing and stuff like that for you guys. Maybe next week. We'll see. I don't want to throw everything at you all week. I mean, this could unfortunately go just a little while, so we'll make it a little fun. So, all right. I think I have talked enough this evening. So I hope that you guys have a good rest of your evening and enjoy your weekend. As a reminder, we are not open tomorrow or Sunday. We'll be back to answering the phones on Monday. If you should need anything, please send an email. You can call and leave a message, and we will take care of you first thing Monday. I will be checking emails over the weekend, but we just won't be there in the store. I have some things I need to do here, like build that online store for you guys. So again, if you have any questions, you can continue to post them here. This live and this tutorial will be up in this group for you forever. It will also live on the YouTube channel forever. So should you decide that Facebook is not for you anymore, you can still see these on YouTube. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend, and I will see you soon. Thanks, guys.